Welcome to the Invent Talks. My name is Saulo Dubard Barbosa and I am head of the Invent Research Center here at emlyon. And today I have the pleasure to have with me Jan Alperovych, who is a professor of finance in our school. Thank you, Jan, for coming here. We just had a seminar with Jan and you were presenting some of the research you've been doing on governments that actually invest in venture capital. And you were presenting a little bit to us the role they have when they assume this role of limited partners. Could you explain in very simple terms, like for a 4-year-old child, what this research is about and why this is so important?
Okay, so what is it? There are two questions. What is it about? It's about how governments can actually increase funding of young innovative companies, which we all know have a potential to grow, to innovate, generate jobs. And so all of these are desired outcomes from the policy perspective. And so the question is how to make them materialize all of that. And one of the ways is to basically provide them with the necessary funding, which they desperately lack. You can do that directly by investing into those ventures as a government, which has been found to be not a very optimal solution. And you can then do it indirectly by providing funding to private funds that will then invest into those ventures. And so that's what that paper was about. Now, why is it important? Well, precisely for the reasons I mentioned, because there is an understanding that economic growth now comes from innovation. And so we want more innovation, and we want more innovation here in Europe, not somewhere else. And because of that, we would like to have these mechanisms, funding mechanisms, institutions that would actually enable that nurturing of that innovation locally here.
What is it that you're finding there that's really interesting?
Well, there are many things there which are interesting. In the paper I just presented, an intriguing part was that, and counterintuitive part was that governments, once they commit to funds, they stick with them, which was something we didn't expect at all. We thought like, okay, if a government has to provide funding to a private venture capital organization in order to stimulate whatever outcomes they like, well, they do it once, but what would be the reasons to do it second time, third time, and so on? That hard to imagine. So we were expecting that they would not do it, they would disengage progressively from them, and this is not what happens. This is actually not at all what happens. So what we saw in our data and with our interviews is that once governments actually provide commitments to venture capital funds, first time, they stick with them second time, third time, and so on.
You were mentioning in your presentation that about half of the VC capital that we have in the world is actually coming from the governments at different levels.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that is the observation. So we did it here in Europe in 2018. Others did it worldwide, and there is this working paper in 2021, which basically accounts for all programs initiated by governments in all possible available parts of the world. And the conclusion is very correlated, whether we talk about Europe or US or worldwide and so on. Of course, you can have regional differences, but on average, almost half of the venture capital industry is funded by government money.
Right. And you also mentioned that in Europe it was like a willingness of the European Commission to actually catch up and help the venture capital industry to grow. How are they doing on that? How are they catching up?
So are they really catching up? It's a very difficult thing to say because, I mean, it depends how you measure it, right? So if you just purely look at the proportion of VC investments to GDP, for instance, we're behind. We were behind, but I don't remember and I don't know at this, like right now, how is the dynamics of it. I know that there is more and more capital in the industry in Europe. Whether it's enough to catch up with the US, I don't think so. No, right. I think we still lag behind. But it's not only about the availability of funds. It's also it's more about the availability of people and talents. And I'm talking about on the supply side of venture capital managers. The best talents go to London and maybe to the US. But it's also about the availability of good startups to invest into. And then again, you have all of these ideas about, like, if you want a good startup, you go to the US, you get more money there. And so with this, yes, the European Commission wishes to develop a European venture capital industry. But we have a slightly different setup here compared to the US. While the US, you have just one country. Okay, it's a federal state, but it's a one country. In Europe, we have a collection of different countries with their own legislation, their own policymakers pulling in all possible directions.
True.
So it's not a trivial endeavor, I would say, to build an equivalent or on par venture capital industry Europe-wise.
Yeah. Is it more challenging now that the UK is kind of out of Europe? Or
how do you measure that?
Yeah, it doesn't really change much.
I don't see how you measure that. I mean, with the UK in, you see, there's always this local bias issue. I mean, in the sense that VCs invest locally. They rarely go abroad. So British VCs would invest in Britain, French VCs would invest in France, German VCs would invest in Germany.
Yeah.
So on a surface like this, as like immediate reaction, if you ask me, I don't necessarily see how that would change much the things.
But one of the main, let's say, protagonists of the story you're telling us on the research seminar was the European Union, right?
European Commission, yes.
Yes.
Well,
So,
European Commission operates the European Investment Fund,
yeah.
which is one of its
It's
basically
one of the big
major
players,
arms, and it's a big player, fairly speaking, yes. But you also have national ones. In France, you have BP France, which is a fairly large player, actually. You have equivalents in Belgium, you have equivalents in Germany, you have the same thing in Italy, you have you have the same thing in Spain. So EIF is just one-off. Yes, it's the large one, everyone looks up to it, but it's just one-off.
Right.
And it's not necessarily a bad idea also to have many different players there. We actually asked that question to these GLP managers. Like, wouldn't that be more optimal to have just one structure, European one? And all of them said no. And they said, like, yeah, it's good to have different people around, different players around, even if they are all government. And they said also that they have different, they use the word sensitivities. Sensibility. Right. So they said, like, oh, we're doing rather this, and they're doing rather that, and we complement each other, and we're not stepping on each one's feet, basically. Yeah. So no, they don't want one superstructure which would be horribly bureaucratic and horribly inefficient.
Very true. Very true. Jan, you have been at emlyon for several years, as I have.
Yeah, too many.
One of the goals of the podcast here is also to highlight, the research, and you've been doing great research over these years. And I know, government investments are just part of your research. What are the other, big themes that you are working on now?
Okay. So presently or?
Presently, yeah.
Okay. So presently, part of governmental venture capital and variants of this is more like a legacy because this is where I started. Half of my PhD thesis was on that. But then I also was interested in productivity of companies that receive private equity or venture capital funding, and from there I recently became interested in productivity of companies that are actually not funded, in a sense that, in the sense of spillovers, basically. In the sense do you have the effect of a private equity or venture capital only on those that receive it, or maybe there are some side effects? So I'm currently interested in that one. Yeah. And even more recently, I became interested in fintech.
Right.
So peer-to-peer lending, to be precise. Now, I wouldn't say that I'm a specialist of peer-to-peer lending at this time because, well, I mean, having one research project and a half on that doesn't make of you a big specialist on the topic, but still, yeah.
I'm curious about the productivity of companies depending on how they're funded. Can you highlight a few of the key finds? You mentioned a few in the seminar.
So if we talk about the direct investments, like when venture capital invests in companies, well, it also depends on what do you mean by productivity, because you know, in the standard sense of it, it's the notion of outputs generated by a set of inputs.
Right.
And while the economists, they have a very specific view of this with a production function that you have to estimate first and so on. What I mentioned during the seminar, that was, I mean, there are lots of different studies that would look at more broadly performance. For example, if you talk about sales growth or job creation, or maybe the growth in total assets, or maybe the innovation. Now that is not exactly productivity. So we have to basically make the slight distinction between the two. What I was mentioning is that when governments, for example, invest in firms, they're not necessarily generating outstandingly good outcomes at this stage. Now, relative to productivity itself. So what I studied first were the productivity patterns in companies that receive private equity, which is a segment of, well, it's not exactly venture capital. It's close to it, but it's not exactly it. And, well, the general conclusion is that whenever you have a private equity firm investing in a company through a leveraged buyout, the productivity of that firm improves. Productivity meaning like the output given the inputs that they operate, meaning fixed capital, labor, and
so they are more productive.
They become, well,
they
become, or at least that is the observation, they become more productive.
Right.
It's
compared to
those that do not receive private equity, for example. Now, this observation is it's very tricky to say it because it also depends on how you identify the effect. And most of the studies that we're talking about right now, it's all secondary data, and so you have to come up with a very good instrument and identification strategy. Oh, I promise not to talk about that. To actually verify that assumption. But well, that's what the literature suggests.
Right. Very good. Very good. I want to move to a different dynamic here in this conversation, because we have prepared cards with the good help of my colleagues.
Okay. I have a button, right?
You have a button?
With the red button.
You can, Well, everything is red here, so you can go. So I want to thank my colleagues, especially Ahmed, Nofal, and Selina Smith for preparing the cards and the questions. So you're basically going to...
it's not like I have 30 seconds per card, right?
No.
Okay.
No. It's like you're going to randomly choose one card.
Randomly.
And you're going to give it to me, because I'm going to read it for you.
Shall I look at it first or no?
No, better not.
Okay.
Because then I can change the question if I don't like it.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. So what is your most surprising finding across all the studies you have worked on? That's a difficult one.
Could we change the question?
So what is your most surprising finding? No, I cannot change the question now. Across all the studies that you have worked on.
And I don't have a joker, right?
No.
Are you tough?
I know you have a long career though. Yeah.
The most surprising.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not just asking for a surprising, you're asking for the most surprising.
I'll take a surprising if you don't have. Like, what is the one surprising finding that comes to your mind?
One, like, for example, what I'm doing right now, the one I presented, right? So the surprising part was the stickiness, for example.
The fact that governments stick with the same...
with the same general partner. Yeah, that was that was not something what I would have expected. Really.
Yeah, you explained that you expected governments to actually
disengage. Yes, because if the idea is to support the young venture capital funds that fundraise for the first time, like you supported them once, fine. Now they should, fly away and be able to operate on their own, just like kids, right? At certain age, you could just kick them out of home, right? You raise them and then they go away, they go out.
That used to be the case. Now they stay 30 years at your home.
Yeah, well, so that's stickiness. That's the
stickiness. They stick.
That's the stickiness, but that's them sticking with you. It's not like you sticking with them, right?
So the government is sticking.
Yeah,
with
that was the
recently
that was the one that was very surprising to me. Yeah.
But you found good reasons to explain that.
Well, it's the interviewees that we asked to explain us what happens, who actually provided us with the insights, because we wouldn't be able to see it from the data we had.
True.
Totally not. So what we saw was something which was counterintuitive, and the data wouldn't tell us why we see what we see. Yeah. So that's why we went asking. I
have to tell you, I appreciated to see a finance professor doing research that is somehow qualitative and including interviews. That's not very typical.
True, that's true. So, okay, the next one must be easier, right?
Yeah.
I'll take this one.
You're choosing the one, I'm not choosing.
And I'm not looking at it.
Who has really inspired you in your journey as an academic? That's a good one. I like this question.
Are they all like this?
Sorry?
Are they all like this? Who really has inspired me? Well, many people actually inspire. I mean, there's not a single one.
You want names, here.
Well, okay, I can tell you one. Mike Wright, for example.
Mike Wright. Yeah.
When I was a PhD student in particular, I remember I actually went to see him when he was, at that time, UK was still in the European Union.
Right.
And it was right after the financial crisis in 2009.
Right.
And it was March, I think, and he went in Brussels to a panel on regulation of private equity, because back then, policymakers, especially in Brussels, they saw the crisis, they saw the consequences. They thought it's all about over-leverage, an excessive use of leverage, and private equity funds are using leverage. And then what they thought is that, we need more regulation, more transparency, and so on. And so there was a panel about that in 2009. Mike came there, and I was a PhD student back then, and I had this idea to go abroad for some time, to stay in a research center somewhere, and Mike's research center on management buyouts was one of the candidates, basically. So I saw Mike. That's how I came to know him. And then I went there, and I remember the first day I was there, I had an impression that I learned so much. So that was like, and talking with him, that was really inspiring.
Yeah.
Now there are many others, of course.
No, but he was truly inspiring.
I mean, if I have to name one name that's kind of snapped it, that was Mike in 2009. But then, of course, I have. Also, I have my PhD supervisor, other people I work with, Sophie, you know her. Well, many people actually. But
it's very, very good choice. Mike is really inspiring. You know, I also met him when I was a PhD student.
Right.
I went to Babson conference. It was in Madrid, 2007.
Okay.
And he was organizing the doctoral consortium. I was part of that. He was co-hosting that with Sharon Alvarez. That's the first time I met
Mike was right. He was really an exceptional.
Yeah.
He was really exceptional. Such a pity he died.
Yeah, real gentleman, and lovely and inspiring. Next one. I like these cards a lot. Thank you, Ahmed. What is the thing you're most proud of as a professor right now?
Right now, what am I the most proud of?
Yeah.
I'm not a particularly proudful person, you know. So it's not like I can say, I'm proud of this or not. But if I have to say it, what I think of, like the first thing I think of is like, I'm pretty satisfied about where have I came to be, given where I come from.
Oh,
Yeah. So that would be my answer.
that deserves some elaboration.
Elaboration.
Yeah.
Okay. The elaboration is that I come from. Well, I was born in Soviet Union in 1982.
Right.
And up until 91, it was still Soviet Union, so I remember being in those scouts, but you call them scouts here, Boy Scouts, but it wasn't scouts, it was pioneers.
Right.
I was part of that. And we had to go through this routine, communist routine,
Right.
back there. And then suddenly everything collapsed.
Right.
Like 91, it's August 19, Soviet Union collapses. And then suddenly it's Ukraine. So a new country, and it used to be a communist state. Now it's suddenly a free market economy, or at least that's how it was advertised. And then the collapse of the educational system, and not necessarily because it was a bad system, but because suddenly you had, in particular in the universities, in professors that used to teach the economics communist way, Marxist economics.
Right.
And they now suddenly had to teach something that they don't know of, and they were disconnected from for a long period of time. And so, that's a tough thing. And to go from there, from that system into here, I think I should be pretty much satisfied with this, right?
Yeah. Do you think this played a role in your choice of studying finance and going?
So the fact that Soviet Union collapsed, right? That one, yeah. Yes, definitely, yes. I remember in the end of '90s when there was basically a point of making a decision about what to study. I remember talking with my parents. So I wanted to be a lawyer. Yeah.
All right.
I wanted to study law, a commercial law.
Right.
And the reason to do that was because I saw some movies with lawyers in them, and in these movies, lawyers were rich. Right? So they would defend companies in courts, and they would become rich because of that, of course, if they win. And so that was the idea. Now, not about becoming rich, but because that was a profession that seems to me was actually a profession that would allow you to earn some living, a decent living. Because being a university professor at that time in Ukraine, you don't do a living. You don't do a decent living by that with that. So yes, that certainly influenced my choice. And now everyone who wanted to make a living, a decent living, basically living, wanted to do a business degree or economics degree or something like that. Right. So I wanted to study law. My parents told me, you could always do that later. Study econ first. Business and econ first.
Right.
Especially because you want to be a lawyer in business law. Right. So study business first and then become a lawyer. So yes, that played a role.
Interesting.
Well, at least in my case, that's how I exposed I rationalized it.
Wow. Interesting. I'm going to shift to this other half of the cards. I've heard they are more difficult.
Okay.
As questions.
Remember, I had some exams like this when I went back to Ukraine. You come to the professor.
Random questions.
Yeah, you read them.
So, do you think of yourself as an optimist or a pessimist?
Depends on which half of a day.
Okay.
Well, in the morning when you're fresh and you're like, okay, now I'm going to do some decent work. I'm going to perhaps have some results. And then by lunchtime, you see that it's going nowhere. And then
you come and film a podcast.
And then you come and film a podcast.
Yeah, right. So at this stage in your life, what is one thing you need more than anything?
More than anything? Oh. Do I need one thing more than anything? Yes, I think I need peace.
Peace.
Yeah. Not just in Ukraine, but in general, because it's very stressful to live through. The times where you basically every single day you have some negative news coming from all over the place. be it in France, be it in out in Europe, be it in Middle East, be it in whatever, right? So it's very stressful to live through times like this.
Very true.
Yeah, and it's also stressful. I mean, it's not only peace because of wars; it's also peace because peace, like basically a calm life because well, there is a climate problem as well in particular, and then there is not a single day where you don't hear all of this apocalyptic
True.
forecasts basically. So it's very stressful, especially when you have to raise kids. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, what can you tell your kids when everything goes havoc?
Yeah. I think this is something that concerns many people. So could you share, is there anything that you do to go through it and, find a little bit of peace of mind, and, what do you tell your kids? And
what do I tell my kids? Well, I don't tell them much. First of all, I can't tell them everything.
Yeah.
I don't tell them much because, well, I'm, again, Soviet Union, then it became Ukraine. I'm from Donetsk, so that where it almost started. Started in Crimea, but then spread over to Donetsk. My parents had to flee twice already. So, and of course, well, the news we are getting from there are all but optimistic at this moment. And of course, I do not tell my kids the details. I do remember that I told my kids the day it happened in February, so 24th February 2022. We woke up. I remember I had a chat with my wife, asking her, like, there is war in Ukraine. Do we tell kids? First we said no, but then 30 seconds later we said no. They're gonna chat at school. It's gonna get known. So we told them that there is war, but because I still have family there,
right?
I told them that there is war, but the family is fine. So, and by now we don't tell them much, of course, of whatever happens. They are 7 and 10 by now.
Yeah.
And so what do I do to have some peace of mind? So first of all, disconnect all connected devices.
That's a good advice.
Yeah, that's one. And including emails, by the way. So it was a funny...
So you mean in the evenings, in the weekends? How?
So yes, I try to stay away from this, from phone, from social media.
Right.
It's not like I never look at it, but I try to have periods of during a week, some periods of time where I don't touch it.
Right.
That's one. Then work is a way out of this, because when you're like full throttle into what you're doing, and that kind of you don't think of that. And perhaps, well, like watching movies with kids, that helps a lot as well. Like spending time with family, basically. But not necessarily with family where you talk politics. The family family meetings usually end up with talking politics. I try to avoid that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's not easy. I mean, again, I'm involved, so it's not easy to stay not involved.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I was asking, what do you do to actually navigate through it? Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, 50 years down the road, if I'm still there, how many years of life expectancy it cost me. Yeah.
Wow. I think we're all supportive. Yeah. I wanted to finish with a couple of, or a series of questions that are really, really fast.
Okay.
One word answer or two.
Okay.
Or a sentence.
Okay, go ahead.
So, what is the number one quality for a PhD student, in your view?
Number one quality
that a PhD student must have.
Well, can I have two?
Yeah.
Okay. A, curiosity. Two, diligence. Like in terms of like hardworking and thorough hardworking. That sort of diligence. Yes.
Okay. Do they change when you go through, assistant professor, full professor?
Whether these qualities,
remain the same, or do they change?
Depends on the person, I guess. I mean, there are people who basically, they do their PhD, they do their publications, and then go on doing other things. Okay. So they probably don't need as much of those. Who knows?
What's the main quality for a full professor then?
Well, I can tell for myself. I mean, I like doing research, and I think these qualities are still there. The curiosity and being like thoroughness in the sense of like in how you do your work. It's not just about, oh, I have this brilliant idea, but I don't do I don't pay the necessary due to research this idea. So,
one thing you don't like in this profession?
absolutely, I don't like referees.
Referees.
Yes.
One thing that you love in this profession?
Good referees. No,
They can make you sweat. You know?
No, but at least they're good. I don't mind good referees, even if they make me sweat. I am absolutely against this sort of referees that do not pay attention, do not get into the. I mean, they're asked to perform some work, and they're basically not doing it properly, and this is something I hate. And hell, there are many of those like this, right? I know. The usual excuses like, "Oh, we don't have time," blah blah blah. Well, we're all in this situation, right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do your job properly. That's one. But I also like another thing. I like students that ask good questions. Right. But this is rare. This is a rare asset nowadays. Yeah.
Nowadays?
Yeah.
Was it better before?
It was,
You
yes.
have this nostalgic...
It used to be better.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, of course, you ask every generation and they will tell you this.
They'll
like,
tell you the same.
in my old
It
times
was
and
much
so on.
better before.
But I'm talking about like 5, 7, 10 years ago.
Right.
So I do remember those students that I used to teach here in the school. And I do see the students that I teach right now. They are comparing. Yes.
Wow.
And I think that, students used to ask more interesting questions back then.
Okay. Is there anything that the current generation improved relative to the first ones that you saw?
Improved?
Yeah. Say, this is better now.
I think they have become, it's basically, it's a cost and benefit. They are more inventive in the sense that they have more imagination.
Okay.
A little bit, but they also horribly dependent on technology for that.
True.
The apps, the phones, and so on. So they can do pretty good work. It's not a bad thing, which the others didn't have because they didn't have access to technology. Would tell me. The thing is that they have ideas. Yes, they have pretty much good ideas. The problem is that they over rely on technology, and then under rely on their own, work and research and so on. Right. It's basically like, I can solve the problem if there is an app. If there is no app, I can't solve the problem.
To finish, one piece of advice to junior scholars, people who are finishing their PhD and want to become a professor and a researcher in your field.
So good advice. I don't know if it's a good advice. The ones who give advice are usually are not the ones that pay. Right. I would say for a junior scholar. Yeah. So the one who finishes a PhD, like
in your field.
In my field. Yeah. Well, I would say the good part, the good starting point would be perhaps to privilege a postdoc in a very good institution rather than having an assistant professor position in a relatively lower ranked institution.
Right.
For example. Yep. So I would say this for young scholars in terms of job placement, of course. Because if they're young scholars and at the verge of defending their PhDs, I suppose they know how to do the work.
Jan, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.